Good afternoon, everybody. I am Stuart Monro. I'm a member of the Council of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and a former scientific director of the Scottish Consortium for Rural Research. I would like to welcome you all to this event organised jointly by the RSE and the SCRR to honour the memory of Professor Peter Wilson. This is the 17th annual lecture, and I'm particularly glad to welcome Peter's family, his son, Stephen, daughter, Rosemary, grandson, John, and daughter-in-law, Carol, who are attending with us today. Peter was a multifaceted individual, a distinguished agriculturalist, former RSE General Secretary, and the father of what is now called the Scottish Consortium for Rural Research. As the Professor of Agriculture and Rural Economy at the University of Edinburgh, Peter could see the need for organisations working on the bush estate to collaborate much more effectively. To facilitate this, he was instrumental in setting up the Edinburgh Consortium for Rural Research, bringing together organisations active in research into land, freshwater, coastal and marine resources, and of course, their uses, including farming, forestry, aquaculture, and recreation. His legacy is the Scottish Consortium, with members across the length and breadth of Scotland. Peter Wilson was elected a Fellow of the RSE in 1987 and served as RSE General Secretary from 1996 till 2001 under two presidents, President Professor Malcolm Jeeves and Sir William Stuart. And that was a particularly challenging time for the Society's development. Peter was awarded the Society's Bicentenary Medal in 2002, an award reserved only for those who have given outstanding service to the Society. On a personal note, I knew Peter when I joined the Rotary Club of Edinburgh, when he was its president. Here I saw not just Peter, the eminent academic, or Peter, the effective committee man and organiser, but Peter, the humanitarian, who did all he could to make this world a better place to live in. Following a short illness, Peter died on the 29th of January, 2004. Today's talk and discussion will be a fitting tribute to Peter. And I now have great pleasure in handing you over to Professor Sarah Skerratt in her role as Scientific Director of SCRR for the next stage of the proceedings. Sarah.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And I echo your warm welcome in memory of Professor Peter Wilson. So I'm indeed the current director of SCRR and also director of programs here at the RSE, but it's the SCRR hat I'm wearing today. And I'd like to introduce our main speaker, our respondent, and our three panelists before handing over to Dr. Rebekah Widdowfield, the Chief Exec of the RSE and Chair of today's event. So our main speaker is Pete Smith, Professor of Soils and Global Change at the Institute of Biological and Environmental Sciences at the University of Aberdeen, and Pete's waving to you there from what looks like a desert island. Our respondent is Dr. Leslie Mabon, Senior Lecturer in Social Science at the Scottish Association for Marine Science at the University of Highlands and Islands. And our three panellists are Professor Lee Innes, Principal Scientist at Morden Research Institute, Professor Lorna Dawson, Head of Forensic Soil Science at the James Hutton Institute, and David Raey, Professor of Carbon Management and Education at the University of Edinburgh and Director of the Edinburgh Climate Change Institute. And you can see we've got an absolutely fantastic set of speakers and respondents, panelists for you this afternoon. And now, without further ado, as the saying goes, I'd like to hand you over to our chair for this afternoon, Dr. Rebekah Widdowfield, who is the Chief Executive of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Over to you, Rebekah.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and welcome everyone to this afternoon event on science for recovery and resilience. We've had over 100 people register for the event, so it's obviously a topic of huge interest, and there's about 70 people who are online just now. In terms of the format today, we're going to kick off with Pete's talk. Pete's going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then Leslie is going to give us a response for 10 minutes, and then each of the three panelists will provide their response and reflections for about 5 minutes each. So that should take about 45 minutes, and then we've got 30 minutes for questions. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, in the centre of the screen. Please do use that to register your questions. You can do that at any time throughout the proceedings. As soon as Pete started speaking, please do sort of get those questions in, and we'll try and run through as many as we can at the end of the once people have stopped the talks. But now, genuinely, without any further ado, I'm delighted to pass over to Professor Pete Smith for our keynote talk. Pete.
So it's a great honour to be giving the Peter Wilson Lecture today. Thank you very much for inviting me. So I've been asked to talk about science for the rural recovery and resilience. So we are facing twin crises today. These are the COVID-19 cases. I downloaded the map this morning for the week leading up to today, and this just shows the cases per 100,000 in the past week. And you can see that it's still a global pandemic. So whilst we're feeling the benefits of an easing of lockdown, there are many areas of the world that are going through the second and third waves of this coronavirus. So we really are in a global pandemic, which has caused untold suffering, human suffering, as well as great economic disruption. The second crisis that we're facing is a climate crisis. So I'm just going to show a quick video. It may work, it may not. If it doesn't, it's no big deal. We've seen global temperatures increase over the last century. So I'm just going to show you an animation from 1880 up until 2020. What you're looking at here are the blue areas are below average temperature, and the red and yellow areas are the above average temperature. So it just paces through. I'm going to show you this. You'll see that it's changing. So as we go forward, we're getting some small changes. Some areas are getting warmer, some areas are cooler, but we're not seeing any overall trend towards it getting bluer or redder. There's a slight warming during the Second World War, but that disappears soon after. And it's only really when we get to the 1970s that we start to see a significant reddening up of the picture. So now we're in the 2000s, we're going through the 2000s, heading up to 2020. And we end in 2020 and we can see that there's a really significant global warming. So there's really no doubt about this anymore. We might have argued about it in the 1970s and the 1980s, but now there is a strong consensus that climate change is happening, the climate is warming, and that humans are responsible. In fact, global temperatures have already warmed by 1.1 degrees since pre-industrial times, and that's pushing 1.2 degrees now. But we know that we need to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. But we've already got to 1.1, so we've only got about 0.4 degrees to go before we start exceeding that 1.5 limit that was laid out in the Paris Agreement. So at current rates of emissions, it's estimated that we will exceed the 1.5 target within 5 to 12 years. So it really is an emergency. We really do need to address this. This is the decade of action. If we don't get on top of it this decade, then we're probably committed to climate change far in excess of 1.5 or even 2 degrees Celsius. Globally, currently we emit about 1,332 tons of carbon dioxide every second. So over 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide every second is emitted. And we obviously need to have greenhouse gas reductions. They need to be immediate and extremely aggressive if we're to meet the 1.5 degree target by 2050. And this led the UK and Scotland and many other countries in 2019 to declare a climate emergency. So we're in a situation now where we have to act. So we've got the twin challenges of increasing climate change, which we have to address immediately. And we've also got the COVID pandemic that we need to recover from. So what's this got to do with a rural recovery and resilience? Well, a few things that I'll cover today is that we have high emissions from the food system. So the food system, what we eat, determines to a large extent what the greenhouse gas emissions are from our agriculture and land sector. The land can be a source of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly from agriculture, but it can also act as a sink for carbon dioxide. So natural systems, forests, peatlands can soak up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, thereby reducing the concentration in the atmosphere. So as well as being a villain, it's part of the solution as well. So we can redesign a food system and manage land differently to help address the climate change. The other thing that came along during this period of challenges was EU exit, but the small silver lining in that cloud was that it does give us an opportunity to rethink how we use the land and how we reward landowners for good management that's beneficial for climate change. So we're no longer in the common agricultural policy. We can redesign the subsidy system and we can incentivize different forms of management and different practices that are aligned with our net zero commitments. And the last thing that I'm going to come back to again at the end is that the economic recovery package that we're going to need to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic offers opportunities to invest in rural low carbon jobs. So that would put us on path to a green recovery that co-delivers to our net zero targets by 2045. So I'll just go through some of those issues and then we'll come back to the economic recovery package in a moment. The first thing is that we can't talk about land and agriculture and diets separately. We have to think about them all together, because a lot of the land we use in Scotland, about 80% in fact, is used for food production to a greater or lesser extent. So what we choose to eat affects the way that we use land. So we can't really talk about what we do with the land without talking about food, diets and agriculture. Now, I'm just going to show a couple of slides showing how diets affect climate change directly. So what we eat determines the amount of greenhouse gases that we emit from the food system. Changing our diets could also free land that we could use for tackling climate change. So it gives a double benefit of both directly addressing climate change and also freeing land that we can use to soak up carbon. I'll just show you a few slides on this to demonstrate what I mean. Globally, about a quarter of all our emissions come from food. So all of the greenhouse gas emissions, we only ever hear about oil and gas on the television, but about 26% of emissions come from the food system. In fact, directly from the food system. When we include all of the other things like transport of food and cooking, that's in excess of 30% of all emissions. So it's really a significant part of the problem of climate change. If we look at those 26% of emissions from the food system, a whopping 58% of those come from animal products. And of those animal products, about half alone just come from beef and lamb. So we know that we've got a large grassland area in Scotland. We produce a lot of ruminants, sheep, lamb, dairy, but this is going to be under threat if we're to meet our net zero targets. So the UK Committee on Climate Change says we need to cut meat and dairy consumption by at least 20% and reduce waste by 20% as well by 2050 if we have to have any chance of meeting our targets. So we really need to change what we eat. We're a country that overconsumes animal products quite significantly. We eat about 80 to 100% more protein than we need. So we could significantly cut back on the animal products that we have in our diets without significantly affecting our nutrition adversely. In fact, it would be healthier for us. This happens because the impact of ruminant meat, and in fact all meats, is far greater than that of plant-based foods. So this is the greenhouse gas emissions in kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilogram of product. And what you can see is the beef and sheep and the other ruminants are up here. The white meats and the seafoods and the eggs and poultry are here, and the plant-based proteins are down here. The climate impact is about 10 to 100 times greater than that of plant-based foods. So if we shift our diets from consuming more products in this to more products in category B, just shifting towards these, eating less meat and dairy and eating more plant-based foods would significantly reduce our direct emissions. In fact, if we look at the diets, this is a meta-analysis of a number of studies. We can see that the vegan diet has the least greenhouse gas emissions, the vegetarian diet also, but there are reduced meat diets which aren't vegetarian and vegan, which also reduce the impact by between about 10 and 20%. So the thing I want to get across in this is that we're not suggesting that everybody becomes vegan. This is not vegans versus meat eaters. Everybody can make a difference by consuming less meat and dairy and by including more plant-based foods in diets. But it's not only the direct impacts that are affected. So again, here we're showing a range of products, food products. And here is these are the greenhouse gas emissions in this one, the land use in this one, energy use, air quality and water quality. And all of these metrics, the ruminant meat has impacts that are about 100 times greater than the plant-based foods. So it's far better for the environment to eat plant-based foods than it is to eat animal-based products, particularly ruminants. And that's particularly the case for land use. So you remember that I said earlier, if we change our diets to consume less ruminant products and less animal products in general, then we can reduce the amount of land that we need that is required for agriculture. In addition to this, over 30% of crops are grown on the planet that they're fed to livestock rather than direct human consumption. So eating less meat and dairy frees up that land to use it for other things. So we could use it for protecting biodiversity, for rewilding, or for tackling climate change by growing trees, vegetation, improving the carbon in our soils and peatlands to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere. Because when plants grow, they remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They fix it by photosynthesis. That carbon dioxide is fixed in the plant material, and as they grow, they lock up that carbon. And some of that is passed down to the soil where it's stored for decades. So the land can be used to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and to help tackle climate change. Nature-based solutions, so these are things like protecting peatlands and woodlands, restoring peatlands and woodlands, better managing them, can help biodiversity and can also address climate change. So we got the opportunity here to change the way that we manage the land that is better for humans and better for biodiversity and better to the climate. In fact, WWF and RSPB quantified how much of a role Scotland has and the UK in general for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the options, the nature-based solutions, fall into these categories: protect the existing peatlands and woodlands and permanent grassland, restore the degraded ecosystems like degraded forests and coastal and marine margins, manage our woodlands and soils better and our agricultural soils, for example, and to create new woodland with native trees. And the estimate is that by 2030, we could sequester around about 75 to 123 megatons of CO2 in the UK. And by 2050, that could reach between about 300 and 500 megatons of CO2, additional mitigation potential to that we've got already. So there's a real big potential there for nature-based solutions. But some words of caution. The land can't do it all. There's not enough land to soak up all the emissions from other sectors like transport, energy generation and aviation. So we can't sit back on our laurels and say, we'll just rely on the land, we'll just manage it differently and it will soak up all of our emissions. We really need immediate and aggressive action across all sectors of the economy if we're to meet net zero targets. So although the land has an important role to play, it's not a magic bullet and we can't rely on it. We have to reduce emissions and then use the land to mop up those additional greenhouse gas emissions that are very difficult to abate, for example, from agriculture. And not all land-based solutions are necessarily good for biodiversity, so they need to be chosen and implemented carefully to get the multiple benefits. You might think of planting production forestry of Sitka spruce, for example, is less good for biodiversity than planting native woodlands. But if implemented carefully, nature-based solutions are good for biodiversity, good for people, and good for adaptation and mitigation. But that needs to be fair, both for the citizens, especially in disadvantaged groups, but also to our farmers and land managers. It's important that we have a just transition to net zero. So what's needed? As I mentioned earlier, EU exit gives us an opportunity to rethink how we reward landowners for good management that's beneficial for climate change. We know that the workforce needed to implement nature-based solutions in the rural environment is insufficient in number, skills and training to deliver these nature-based solutions that we've talked about at the pace required to achieve net zero by 2045. So putting these two things together, we know that we're going to need a COVID-19 economic recovery package, and that gives us an opportunity to invest in a jobs-based recovery in rural low-carbon jobs for a green recovery that co-delivers to net zero. So let's just have a look at what that might look like. This was published by the Green Alliance last year, which was called Levelling Up Through Nature. It was outlining a green recovery. Over on the left, we can see the labour market challenge, which is mapped out. The darker areas have the highest challenge. So you can see Highland, for example, has a larger labour market challenge, and some of the areas in the north of England, Wales, and etc. have this large challenge, which needs to be addressed. If we're looking at the bog restoration opportunities, the woodland creation opportunities, and the seagrass opportunities here. This is just an example from Northern England, but we have excellent examples in Scotland as well. We can see that there are big opportunities to match the labour market challenge, to invest in green jobs in those areas, to deliver these nature-based solutions that we need, and we know that are out there. Some examples in Scotland. This is the breakdown of jobs in Scotland that are in nature-based activities and nature-dependent sectors. 35% are in agriculture, 25% in the food and beverage industry, less in forestry and logging, a few in aquaculture, but there are some others in these associated industries, for example, travel and accommodation and tour operators and manufacture of food products. All of these things would benefit from enhancing our nature-based solutions. And these are some sample jobs that could be created that are required within the Cairn GOMS Connect. So these are some examples of the jobs that could be created. So we've got a real opportunity here. If we look at the UK is investing in economic fiscal stimulus packages after COVID-19. So there's a certain amount of money that's being spent. And if we look at how green that investment is, we can see that the UK is actually doing reasonably well, with the vast majority of that economic stimulus leading to a positive and green recovery. So we have the potential, it's moving in the right way. For example, if we look at Russia has invested a lot in the economic recovery, but none of those could be considered to be green solutions. So our challenge is to get as much of this green recovery funding above the line in this blue area. So just to reiterate, as a planet, we're currently dealing with an unprecedented twin emergencies, the global COVID-19 pandemic and the global climate emergency. We need to change the way we farm, what we produce, and the way that we manage our land. An EU exit means that we have the opportunity now to rethink that. Just this moment in time, it will pass, so we have to take it, we have to seize it, to make sure that we get the type of farming, the type of land use, and the type of jobs that we support with public money. We need a jobs-based COVID-19 recovery to fill the skills gap in the rural economy. And we need an economic recovery package that helps society to recover from the pandemic, as well as tackling the climate emergency. In short, to reboot our economy on a new, greener, fairer trajectory. And this opportunity will not come again, and we must not waste it. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Pete. That was a fantastic canter through in 20 minutes, climate change, land use, and the opportunities for recovery as part of that. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Leslie Mabon from the Scottish Association for Marine Sciences at the University of Highlands and Islands. And Leslie's going to give about a 10-minute response.
Okay, great. First of all, thanks very much, Rebekah, for the introduction, and thank you, Pete, for a wonderful and stimulating talk that's given me plenty to think about. I'd like to start my response by reflecting on some of the slides that Pete showed right at the start about the global COVID situation and also the climate change situation on a global level, because I think those tell us something very important that we need to bear in mind when we're talking about COVID recovery and indeed climate responses in Scotland. So we saw from both of those graphics that the parts of the world that are going to be hit hardest and have been hit hardest by COVID tend to be the global south. These are the places that will also be hit first and hardest by the effects of climate change. However, we've seen with issues like vaccines that there is a real challenge in getting the knowledge, the skills and the technology to the places that need it most in order to recover quickly and fairly. And I think that's going to be absolutely critical for climate change as well, both globally, but also at a national level. And what I'd like to do over the next 9 minutes is just to pick out 3 points that reflect, I think, on how we can ensure that rural areas and rural communities in Scotland are empowered with knowledge, technology, science and innovation in order to lead and be fully involved in a just recovery and indeed a just transition to net zero. So the first thing I want to talk about is this, this point that Pete had made about managing land differently to address the climate challenge. And I'll start by saying I wholeheartedly agree with that, and I think that's absolutely vital. I'm going to add a little bit extra though, because I live in Oban. I work at the Scottish Association for Marine Science, so I'd say that we can make these points as well in the context of managing not just our land, but also our coasts and our seas. And what is absolutely vital within this is to ensure that anything that's done in the interests of recovery or a just transition at the national level does not further disadvantage or put excessive burden on rural and potentially remote communities. So for example, we've seen quite a lot already with renewable energy. Scotland at a national level is doing brilliantly in terms of producing renewable electricity from wind. But communities, also trade unions, some environmental NGOs are now starting to take a step back and say, hang on, what's actually in this for the parts of the country that are having to shoulder some of this infrastructure, are having to make the multiple, making most of these changes in the interest of kind of making national goals and national objectives. So it's really important that when we think about managing land differently, managing our seas and coasts differently, that we consider how that can bring benefit to rural communities that perhaps could need to stand to benefit most from these activities. So for example, it might be managing land differently to preserve carbon sinks, it might be hosting renewable energy. All of these things, as I say, need to be done in a way that help us to meet our global and national climate obligations, but also can support communities locally. So just for example, looking out the window right now, I can see Caledonian McBrain ferries, I can see little barges that are taking things out to fish farms, I can see ships that are filled with timber logs that have come in from one of the islands. Our rural landscapes in Scotland are lived in, working environments. And we need to ensure that they can help us meet the climate challenge in a way that also allows them to continue to be lived in, working and productive environments that provide jobs and economic opportunities for the people that live there. So that's my first point, is about how we ensure that this transition is just for our rural societies. My second point I want to come on to is to talk a bit about nature-based solutions. And I was really, really pleased that that Pete had this point in his slides about how we can't expect the land to do it all, and that nature-based solutions ought to be fair, because those were 2 points when I was doing my homework last night that I thought were really vital. So I'm really pleased to see that these are here, and I strongly agree with them. What I will add a bit about nature-based solutions, though, is that this is a word that has really come into the language of policy, government and science in the last few years. And there are maybe people sitting, listening along, watching along today who are perhaps wondering what it is that we mean by nature-based solutions. And I have a bit of a kind of built-in aversion to buzzwords. As a social scientist by training, as a critical social scientist, I have a built-in healthy skepticism towards any kind of new language. And so what I would say is that the idea that we can manage our natural and semi-natural ecosystems in a way that allows them to sustain themselves and also bring multiple benefits to people, that idea is not new. And I'm sure we all know this, and most people watching today will probably feel the same. The idea that we can derive multiple benefits from nature through appropriate management is not new. As a society, we've been doing that for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Nonetheless, climate change does make things more challenging. Increased pressures that we face from population changes also make that more challenging. What I think is absolutely vital is that we're now getting to a stage where people in policy and government are starting to an extent to pick up and use this idea of nature-based solutions. I'm seeing the word appearing in all kinds of different contexts. And I think as researchers, as scientists, it's really important that we ensure that the people that we're entrusting to make decisions at national and regional and local level on our behalf understand where this idea of nature-based solutions come from, and they understand this long tradition of research into areas like ecology, biology, and indeed social science that underpin the current rhetoric around nature-based solutions. So I think that's really important. Absolutely, nature-based solutions are definitely not a silver bullet, and it's absolutely vital that we keep within that the need for a good evidence-based and scholarly understanding of how our natural and semi-natural ecosystems work, and realise that the benefits they bring are multiple. They can be to do with mitigating climate change. They can also be to do with adapting to climate change by reducing risks from flooding, from coastal erosion, even from heat risk. And also they can help to create more resilient societies by giving people opportunities for recreation, health, well-being and interaction. But the critical point to realise there is that this needs to be underpinned by a good knowledge and evidence base of what nature-based solutions are and how they work. And the final point is I want to pick up on perhaps the last point that Pete had in his talk, and this is about a just recovery and indeed a just transition and what that means. And I've got a wonderful quote, and I can't remember who told me this. It was in an interview I was doing for research a couple of years ago, and that was that there will be no shortage of jobs in a net zero world. So there will be no shortage of work to do in a net zero world. And I think that's a wonderful way to think about the opportunity, but also the challenge that lies ahead of us. So it's absolutely right that there are going to be lots of things that need to be done on the way to a net zero society. But again, to go back to the point I made right at the start, I think it's absolutely imperative that for Scotland's rural regions and communities, that the jobs that come are high value, give opportunities for innovation, for knowledge growth, and particularly allow young people to stay and make a living in the communities that they've grown up in and that they live in. And so we'd add to that, I would only add to that science, innovation and research for a just recovery needs to be embedded within a much wider suite of policy measures. And this is where the social sciences and social policy are, I think, really important. So our rural communities in Scotland face a number of challenges. Tourism is great, again, at a national level for the economy, but often it's our rural communities that have to disproportionately shoulder the burden of the challenges that come with that in terms of second home ownership, finding affordable housing to enable people to stay in the area, and also trying to perhaps stem over reliance of local economies on tourism. So, I think we need to think about how do we provide affordable housing, how do we provide the infrastructure in terms of roads and connectivity that are going to enable this innovation to happen and that are going to create high value jobs for our rural societies. So I can see I'm at 10 minutes. So I will simply stop there with one concluding thought, which is that knowledge, science for a just recovery and just transition is vital for Scotland. But for it to be effective for our rural areas, we need to ensure that the people that live and work there are engaged and involved in producing the knowledge and shaping the range of possible outcomes from the outset. So thank you again to Pete for an absolutely fascinating talk, and I look forward to discussing with the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie, and that's been some really good prompts, and I can see we've got some more questions coming in, and please do keep them flowing. We're now going to have some short and sweet responses from 3 additional panelists with 5 minutes each, and we're kicking off with Professor Lee Innes, who is the Principal Scientist at the Morden Research Institute. Lee, over to you.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. First of all, I'd really like to say thank you to both Pete and Leslie for some really stimulating talks, and it's really sort of set the scene for this discussion. Now I've got 5 minutes, so I'm going to cut to the chase a bit here, but in my lifetime, there have been 2 events that I remember. One, I was very young, which was the Apollo landings on the moon. And that picture we've got there of the Earth rising, I think is one of these really big perspective pictures that really makes you think about our planet. And there's only a few people in the world who've actually seen that, obviously, in with the Apollo missions. And there's a super book written by Andrew Smith called Moondust, and I'd recommend it to all of you to have a read of. And it's a journalist who interviewed all the people, there was 12 of them, who actually landed on the moon. And I think that perspective of looking at our planet from that distance really sets the scene for this discussion today. And I think the climate emergency is the biggest thing we're facing. The other area, which is obviously focusing this discussion, is the COVID pandemic. And that's the other occasion 50 years later that we're in now, where the whole world is focused on the global pandemic and dealing with an infectious disease. So as both Pete and Leslie have said, this is the perfect time for us to really think about what we can do to basically save our planet. This is the biggest discussion we have just now. My background is I work in infectious diseases. So I was obviously very engaged with the COVID pandemic, and I'm very interested in One Health and how we can use that sort of understanding of humanity, the animals in the planet, and the environment to create One Health solutions. So I'm just going to flick through a couple of other slides now. I'm really conscious of my time. Livestock get quite a bad press, but I really wanted to make the point that I've worked all of my career in livestock and looking at infectious diseases, and livestock are very important for both food security. They provide high quality protein from grazing grass. So there's a lot of benefits if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals that livestock do contribute. But what we really need to do is be able to farm these much more sustainably. And also the area that we work in at Morden is very much looking at how we can control disease to get healthier livestock with fewer environmental impacts. There's a lot of science going on to try and make sure that livestock production is sustainable. I obviously will not go into all of these just now, but there's plenty going on. And one of the things I'd really highlight here is vaccination. Vaccination has been used a lot, as we know, to help us with COVID. It's probably saved us and will continue to do so with lots of infectious diseases. And we're also doing a lot of work with this in livestock as well. Another thing I'd point out really is the One Health approach is very inclusive. And I think that's really important that we look at traditional and new technologies to help us with these emergencies. I'll just finish up with a few questions and some thoughts. We're in a really important and critical time just now to really engage with this and actually do something about it. There's a really important conference going to take place in Scotland, which is fantastic, in November, which is the COP26. There's also the Convention on Biological Diversity that's taking place in China. And again, this is really important when we look at the planet. The loss of biodiversity is a real issue. Scotland is working towards net zero by 2045, and I think science can help provide a lot of the solutions that we're needing. But how do we decide what to implement And I think importantly, probably for this debate, is how do we actually engage people to make this a priority? We know in the past that if we engage people, we can get solutions. And if we look at how the world has behaved with COVID, it's a miracle that we actually got a vaccine out in such a short time, and it is a lifesaver. So we can do it if we apply ourselves, but how do we actually do that? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee. I didn't even have to put my camera on. We're going to pass over now for the next 5 minutes to Professor Lorna Dawson, and Lorna's Head of Forensic Soil Science at the James Hutton Institute. So Lorna, over to you.
So thank you very much, Pete. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Lee. I will go straight into the slides. I'm going to give an overview. I think we can see quite clearly that we are in a time of multiple crises. I would just add a little bit more to that biodiversity loss crisis as well, which has been indicated already in the 3 presentations we've heard today. It's adding that other level of complexity as to how we find the solutions. In Scotland, we're fortunate we've got fantastic institutions, fantastic universities, fantastic near to our policy, near to industry, near to all the people that we can co-construct and co-develop solutions to these issues. The context of the research that we've got in Scotland, and how, for example, at Safari Gateway, how we can bring together across the portfolio, including research being done at the universities, and also how linking with the knowledge brokers, linking with policy, directly developing that knowledge exchange that Lee said, the importance of communication and that knowledge exchange, and working together how we can integrate that, the research, using a whole range of different methodologies, but also including things like disruptive approaches, how we're going to get that transformational change. Directly working with policy, we're fortunate because of the size of Scotland that we can work directly. We're quite close to the centre of policy making, working with agencies, industry, and also the rural communities, people that really are making a difference about what's happening in their own place. Place-based information is so important. How we can integrate that low carbon, we heard from Pete, the low carbon principles of farming, and how we can look at ways, for example, Lee talked about improving the welfare, genetic improvements, diet improvements of animals, and not forgetting the many benefits in terms of the West Coast, the climate, and the grassland, and the sequestration that goes on in those parts of Scotland, and harnessing that natural capital. We heard from Leslie the importance of looking at our natural capital and engaging people and communities so they're making decisions about their own futures. So a climate response should create economic opportunities, delivering that sustainable economic growth, the One Health and the just transition. And an example of some of the work that we've done at Safari Gateway is that we input to policy developments, and here with the Just Transition Commission, we supported that work with a fellowship and also with workshops where we went to the rural communities and got feedback into that policy development by the local communities, so that it has now been published and it's embedded in that just transition, the work that was done in legislation, regulation and planning, developing using existing structures that are there, and again linking closely to the development goals. One of the studies we also, Robin Pakeman has been looking at debunking that what the words that people use about ecology and nature-based solutions. So some of the work he's doing is currently with Nature Scot, a safari project, a fellowship, to look at how best we communicate those principles, because often it's not the clearest language that is used. But one of the other projects that he led was the question of, should we graze our uplands? And what he found was that there's winners and there's losers, and there's no easy answer, as you can imagine. For example, there was a more diverse bird community with the expansion of scrub and woodland and reduction of grazing. But there was an issue of, there was an impact on species such as meadow pipits and merlin, those that feed on them. The reduced grazing led to more carbon storage above ground. But that whole debate, the biodiversity and carbon storage, is more nuanced than that, and there can be negative and positive impacts. One of the other areas, and again we touched on it, was the benefits of peatland restoration, and how we restore those degraded peatland to the form. And we can see here in the slide on the right from the work by Evans, in fact Rebekah contributed to this, that important attributes such as the water table depth can very much affect what happens with that greenhouse gas emission balance. And so that we need to take that research into account with having the right decisions to avoid the awful things that can be happen with that huge problem with degrading our peatland, to give the best practice decisions to ensure maximum environmental, economic and social benefits. And grassland sustainability, a work that was carried out by Lorna, looked at the triple bottom line of working the people for the benefit of the planet, and also the fact that it's business, that the bottom line is these are farm businesses that have to operate. And it just leads on from the work that Lee was talking about, how it's integrating the research that's being done, the fundamental science, social science, as well as physical and biological sciences and chemical sciences, and also integrated with policymakers and farmers. So co-constructing solutions. And in this particular project, Lorna developed monitoring sustainability under different metrics so that we could be suggesting what are the important routes, the metrics for sustainability in such systems. Also in arable systems, adopting principles of agroecology, using a diversity of land use, biodiversity, insect populations, crop varieties, conservation tillage, a whole range of different principles that can be applied to agriculture. And these are all being included and considered within the farmer working groups on climate change. But also a fair agroecological future in the Food Farming Countryside Commission, working with IDRI, modelling what would happen across Europe. And in the United Kingdom, benefits to adopting an agroecological approach have great benefits in terms of, Pete talked about the plate, what do we eat, what is a good diet, good quality food, while making sure that we're looking after the planet. And the Food Farming Countryside Commission have principles of thriving communities. They're vital to the future green recovery of Scotland, reforming the rural payments, we had this talked about already, and progressing the land use and marine planning to secure that healthy Scottish environment. These are the essential building blocks to securing sustainable food and land use systems. But it's also about the quality of that food. And some of the work, this is Wendy Russell here, has been done under Safari Gateway. And the food and its climate change implications, the food systems where 20% of the total global emissions carbon, but there's been that agro-biodiversity loss, but we wish for healthier food rich in bioactives, and also research onto other alternative crops. In this case, it's hemp. And it is a very carbon neutral crop to grow with multiple benefits in terms of land remediation and carbon sequestration.
Thanks, Lorna. Sorry, we're a bit short of time. Do you want to just make a few final comments, and we'll pass on to David?
Reflecting on that, a project working with the Islands Revival, research on the edge, it was the people there themselves, participants from local groups, came up with a decision that made they could show that there were green shoots of recovery there. And if you wish to look at some of the other projects that are going on at the bottom, the safari farm tours, you can see some of these projects that are delivering across the country to the huge issues and the importance of working together in collaboration, bringing the science to policy directly relevant for the communities of Scotland.
Thank you very much, Lorna. And again, picking up some of the themes of previous speakers as well, in terms of the breadth of knowledge and expertise and science that's required to address these issues, and the key importance of just transition throughout. And our last respondent, I'm very pleased to invite now Professor Dave Raey, who's Professor of Carbon Management and Education at the University of Edinburgh, to give the final 5-minute response. So David, over to you.
Thanks so much, Rebekah. And it's always hard going last because everyone said all the crucial things, but just to reflect quickly in my 5 minutes, I mean, I guess that the points on green recovery and the I really like the point both Pete and Leslie made actually about the jobs-based rural recovery. I think that's core to it, and I need to admit my bias because I just think education as part of that, the skills and training that I guess the new workforce and the existing workforce need for the net zero transition is kind of it's crucial. It'll underpin it all. It'll decide whether we succeed or fail ultimately in terms of that sustainable transition to net zero. I guess one of the key things about it, and again this has been touched on already, is how this kind of green recovery and alignment with our net zero targets in the rural economy has the potential to address those long-standing inequalities and also the impacts of COVID we've seen particularly on young people and those in disadvantaged situations. Even before COVID, it's kind of exacerbated those. So this is a chance in a lifetime to get this right, but there's so much to play for, not just for climate, but as we've heard about in terms of realising this just transition narrative and the principles around it, and actually making the future of Scotland one which is zero emissions, net zero emissions, but also, you know, the well-being of the whole country can be improved by this if we get it right. So on the skills training front, I think there's so much to be done, but there's a lot of good practice. So one of the things we need in terms of the whole rural economy is to make sure we're attracting and retaining great new entrants, whether it's in farming or forestry or tourism or other sectors. And the kind of climate action and nature protection narratives need to come through in terms of what a positive career folk can follow in those routes. So really, you know, making a good living, making a sustainable livelihood, like Leslie pointed out, but actually helping to make the world a better place. It sounds cheesy, but actually that narrative needs to come through strongly in terms of particularly the new entrants we need in farming and other jobs in the rural sector. And as part of that, we need the school-based teaching to reflect that, the careers advice and support for the next generation to experience, you know, what rural work can be, how rewarding it can be, so that, again, the point that Leslie made, that we retain people locally and inspire people to be part of the net zero transition. And I guess across the facets of formal training, right through to what SRUC does with the farmers, you know, giving them the tools in terms of, for instance, new rural support, what that's going to look like in terms of low carbon farming methods, things like woodland restoration and planting, peatland restoration, all of the opportunities that come with a low carbon food production system, not just for Scotland, but actually the export markets. All of that is part of the kind of training and skills context we need to really deliver on in spades, literally and metaphorically, in Scotland. The other area I just wanted to flag was the advisory services. So in Scotland, again, we've got a great advisory system, but one which needs to support this transition to net zero across the rural economy. In terms of farm advisory services, that's crucial so that farmers know not just what is expected in terms of reporting and new management techniques, but how to do it, how to actually implement that, learn from it, share that good practice. So I guess I'll finish just saying, as a carbon geek, a self-confessed one, it'd be really easy for me to kind of throw out the carbon blinkers when we think about net zero and say, right, we need to achieve net zero at any cost. But as we've heard from all the speakers, that would be a completely unsustainable route. In reality, if you had that kind of siloed transition, just looking at carbon, then actually you would fail to tackle climate change and damage all the other parts of our society and our economy. So what we've got at the moment, as we've just heard, is an incredible opportunity in terms of the science base we have in Scotland, the expertise, our land users across Scotland. We know this is a big challenge, but we have the tools to do it and to deliver for climate change, biodiversity, food production in a way which really helps Scotland, you know, exemplify a just transition to net zero in a way where other nations also can learn from our approach, learn from our mistakes if we're honest about them. And COP26 has been mentioned. Actually, that is a great platform to tell the world about what we're doing and how we're going to achieve this sustainable transition to net zero.
Thank you very much, David. And that concludes our responses from the panelists, and that now takes us over to the questions. And we've got just about half an hour for that. There's plenty of questions coming through the Q&A, which is fantastic. The great thing about the Q&A is that you can vote for a question. If you give it a like, it will move up to the list. The bad thing about that as a chair is that the question that you thought was somewhere in the list has suddenly disappeared and ended up elsewhere. So I'm going to kick off though with a question that I think leads into a number of the other questions that people have asked, which is from James Curran, and it's really asking about how do we get private investors engaged in nature-based solutions. Money is tight, the public sector can't do everything. Sometimes there aren't the financial returns from investing in nature-based solutions. So how do we get the private sector more engaged? And I think there's a related question from Lucy Philby about how do we ensure that government funding doesn't crowd out that private investment as well. So is there anyone who wants to kick off with that? Pete? And then David.
Yeah, so I do a little bit of work advising Carbon Director, which is a company that puts together projects which use nature-based solutions and engineered solutions for carbon removal, together with corporate clients. So some big players like Microsoft who have trillions to spend on it. And the thing that you notice looking at that is that the demand far outstrips the supply. So they're just falling over each other to spend money on nature-based solutions. But at the moment, the projects aren't out there. Part of the solution, I think, is to educate the landowners how they can collectivize, because an individual farmer can't trade on the carbon market, but a group of farmers could, or a large landowner could potentially do that. So it's getting the expertise in to put their proposal for a land use change or for a land management change into a form that would make it viable for selling on the voluntary carbon markets. So I think that's something that just doesn't exist at the moment, and that's something that would allow the private sector investment to grow. The money's out there, we just need to access it.
Thanks, Pete. David, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is you need good science as well. So being a carbon geek and knowing carbon markets, they've largely been based around fossil fuels and those kind of industries because the numbers are more robust. And there's always been an issue with land-based sequestration and carbon markets that there's an accusation that they're not permanent, that they're too uncertain. And so this is where the community, so Rebekah Arts' work was mentioned in terms of peatlands. We're getting better numbers, and actually we have a key role as the research community, as scientists, in improving those numbers to allow good investment in carbon sequestration, in protecting carbon sinks and stocks.
Thanks so much, David. Leslie, I think you wanted to come in, but I'm actually going to link on to another question that you might be well placed to respond to as well, which was about how do we get private landowners engaged in this? So not just private investors, but private landowners. They own large swathes of land in Scotland. What would be the best mechanisms to engage them? And should we be taking a four-nation approach, or should we be thinking more just in terms of Scotland? So I don't know if you can pick those up together.
Absolutely, great. Yeah, I can certainly say something that speaks to all of those. So I was glad James Curran had asked the previous question, because the example I was going to give of a really good way of thinking about nature-based solutions and land management for resilience is the Glasgow City Region Adaptation Strategy, which has just been launched. And I think from a private land ownership point of view, there's maybe a kind of carrot and stick approach that we can take. One being a kind of stick approach in terms of whether you can mandate certain practices through planning, building and management codes and legislation. Another one being, and this maybe follows on from what David said a minute ago, about building an evidence base for the benefits of taking action and also the risks of not taking action. So this again is something that Glasgow City Region has done really well in terms of climate change adaptation and nature-based approaches, is building that evidence base for why there is a business case for managing environments and ecosystems in a way that is going to reduce some of the impacts and risks that we might face. A couple of other things just to add as well is whether there are ways to empower communities or groups of stakeholders to be able to take control of land in ways that can allow them to do things that bring benefit. So there's a lot of good work being done, maybe not rural, but in Glasgow, on building a register of vacant land. We're also seeing a lot more around community buyouts. And so there's different models through which people that perhaps have traditionally been less empowered but might stand to get the most value from the land might now have pathways to have more ownership, or at least more ways to get benefit from that land. So that's a long and rambling answer to what I think are two very good questions.
Well, thank you for being very sporting, David, Leslie, sorry, and picking up both of those together. I wonder, Lee, if I could bring you in on this, because you're obviously talking about the importance of public engagement. There's another question, I guess, which again connects in some ways about getting the public involved and avoiding NIMBYism in terms of green infrastructure, and how we're making sure we're sort of paying the dividends back to the communities. But what would your response be in terms of actually how we get the public involved, whether they be landowners or people just in a local community just who care about where they live?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I don't have a single single answer to that. But I think one of the things we probably should do more of is actually sort of listen to the local community, get out there and find out what they're interested in. And that's the same with landowners. If you find out what they're doing, what they're interested in, get more of the public involved. I think I mentioned in my talk, how do we get people engaged? And this is one of the key things. But I think if people feel that they have some ownership of their communities, so it's back to how does it affect you and your community, and what can you do to help? I think a lot of people would be really keen to engage and help if they understood what would be beneficial. So I think having those conversations actually with people, finding out how they can get involved and actually working together collectively. So we are talking about empowering local communities. And I think the private landowners can also get involved in that. And we've done some work with them on very specific projects. And I think if we're looking at science solutions, they can also get involved in that. So I think a lot of it is down to listening to people and communication and involvement.
Thank you very much, Lee. Maybe pick up a question that that's been raised by a couple of people in slightly different ways, which is the question about how we use our own land, but actually how we use other people's land as well. So Julie Fitzpatrick is asking a question around actually, I guess, what we might call the unintended consequences if we're not using some of Scotland's land for food. Well, where are we getting that food from? And if we're importing that, aren't we simply just offshoring greenhouse gas emissions? But also, what might be some of the other consequences of that? So for a seminar that's got resilience in the title, what does that mean if we're importing a lot of our food? So is there anyone who wants to pick that up in terms of how we use land, the unintended consequences? Pete? And then Leslie.
I think Julie makes a great point. We've got lots of grassland that we can't use for anything else, so we can use that to raise ruminants and to raise those products. I think that it's not incompatible to reduce the amount of livestock product we eat, and so that we don't need to have imports. So I don't think it would be viable to close down the livestock industry and import just the same amount of livestock. We know that there are ways of raising livestock which do still damage the climate but are more environmentally benign. So we can just sort of, I think it's been described as a less and better form of meat. So we can try and raise our ruminant meat, consume less, but where we raise it and as much as possible finish it on grass with less concentrates in the mix. So that is a way forward, I think, for the industry. But on the other hand, I don't think we can be Pontius Pilate about it and just say we're very good at growing ruminant meat, so we can just continue growing livestock products and export them to the rest of the world because we do it really efficiently. There are a bunch of other countries doing that, and remember there are over 800,000 people go to bed hungry and undernourished every night. So we're taking away, if we're still saying we're going to continue with business as usual, when others need to maybe produce more livestock at a global level, that is, I think, ethically questionable.
Thanks, Pete. Leslie?
Just something else I'd like to add, and this maybe sounds really patently obvious, so I apologise for this, but the land is not the only place in Scotland where we can get food. We're a coastal nation, we've got a lot of islands, a lot of water, and the sea has got great potential. Now, I'm going to bracket what I say there by being very clear that I don't want to be an apologist for the aquaculture industry, and there are significant and legitimate concerns that people have. Nonetheless, there is also a lot of potential for our seas to produce food, nutrition in sustainable ways if that's done appropriately. That can include shellfish, seaweed as well. So I think there's an important issue to just flag up when we talk about resilience more broadly in food systems, is that often the land and the sea are taken very separately in planning and governance. Now, a friend of mine said there's almost literally a line in the sand. Whereas by considering the land and the sea holistically, we can maybe add a bit more nuance to how we think about these issues.
Thanks so much, Leslie. Does anyone else want to come in before we move on? Dave?
Yeah, so I just want, because I saw Andrew Heald had also put in this point about offshoring and thinking about the system. And I think that's such a good point. So his point is related to the food one and offshoring emissions. But if we think about where we need to go with Scotland, we need more timbering construction. We need the whole economy to decarbonise. And so part of that is if we're, we need to grow more trees that we then use in Scotland in construction, for instance. So that systems thinking, I think, in terms of our land use planning. So Andrew says we need integrated land use planning. We've been talking about that for decades. The land use strategy, the third land use strategy, talks about it as well, but we kind of need to do it. And we need to think about not land use as this separate thing, or just like Leslie said, land use separate from marine environment. Actually, land use is where we live, and it's connected to things like energy supply, our housing, our food production, as well as the natural environment. So that systems thinking, it's great to say we should think systems wide, but we actually need to do it and ingrain that in terms of the policy approach which underpins the transition to net zero.
Thanks so much, David. And you come on exactly onto the question I was going to pick up. And for those people who haven't seen it, Andrew is saying that the UK is currently importing about 1 million cubic metres of sawn timber and board every month. And I guess that does raise that point, is, not just thinking about, within a country, but actually thinking across countries and thinking about consumption emissions as well as production emissions. Lorna, Lee, is there anything else you wish to add to sort of the whole question about what we import, what we export, and looking at things in the round?
I'd just like to add, Rebekah, a very good question. Just recently, there's been a whole issue about importing biomass for boilers, where we've got our own timber, and yet the amount that we're bringing in to pollute is so wrong. So there's so many things, if you look at a global level, that we need to sort out, and that's just one of them. And our full food system is wrong. With the inequalities we have, the malnutrition we have in the United Kingdom, with obesity and non-communicable diseases, is just awful. And it's worse, we know, in certain areas in Scotland. And we must try and tackle that inequality, because until we have that equality at different places for people, then we're going to have ill health linked ultimately to all these other issues that people are facing. And it's going to be a lot worse for certain people, certain sectors of society. So that we as scientists, economists, we need to be putting our heads together and trying to make life a lot better for a lot of people living in Scotland.
Thanks, Lorna. Lee, you wanted to come in, or shall I move on to the next question?
Yeah, just to add that I think, in Scotland, we do produce some of the world's best food. And I think if you're looking again at food miles and what we're doing locally, I think there's a lot we can do locally that does not require importing so much. So we have got quite a lot of solutions already in Scotland.
Thanks so much, Lee, and nice to have that positive note to remind as well. There's lots of good stuff going on. I'm going to pick up a couple of questions which I think are very much about behaviour change. And thinking about COVID. I mean, COVID has seen interventionists in the way in which we live our lives and operate, which we would have never have anticipated as being possible or indeed acceptable. And I think that raises questions for me about actually, does that mean that there is opportunities to be more interventionist and that there might be more public acceptability than is sometimes considered? So there's a question from Jeff Sim, who's basically asking about, is persuasion enough to get people to change their or amend their dietary choices. And from Celine Delavre, who's asking about actually how we change the culture and mindset of people working in the farming community, or some of those who might be more driven towards a sort of high yield intensive farming. So is there anyone who wants to pick up on the behavioural change point? Because otherwise, Leslie, I am going to come to you, but I'll come to Dave first.
Yeah, just to say that persuasion isn't enough. So, you know, you can tell folk all you want, like we have for years, about energy efficiency, that, you know, we should all be more energy efficient. That doesn't necessarily translate into behavior change. And I think one of the key things that is part of it, but one of the things, so Pete and I and others on this call being part of the Scotland's Climate Assembly, so talking to people from across Scotland about what we should do to tackle climate change. One thing you get is a hugely impressive level of awareness about climate change. You also get that real call for, I guess, a voice for, you know, for everyone to have a say in terms of what happens locally. So having that place-based lens. And I think a key part of that is not just a voice about what we do in our own homes and kind of individual action, but it is about that system again. It is about what government puts in place, how doable they make it. Is it just something the middle class do because they've got more money to spend on fancy food or you know, electric car? Or is it something actually where it is made doable for us and we understand why we're having to do it, but more importantly, we're able to do it? And I think that part of the equation, you know, is much more effective than just putting out the messages and trying to persuade people.
Thanks, Dave. Leslie, do you want to come in?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think just a couple of points just to add on to that. First is I'm always very cautious about taking positives out of COVID, given what a horrific thing it has been and continues to be. Nonetheless, what we have seen is we've seen a situation in the last year and a half where, you know, we've shown that if we treat an issue seriously enough, that the government can mobilise the resources to respond to it, and that as a society, you know, we will be willing in the main to change our behaviours and adapt to it. So, you know, that's something that we can potentially learn from down the line. Again, just kind of bringing the rural angle in, the one thing I will just add to follow on to what David said is about some of the challenges that are particular to rural areas. And so I'm thinking about housing stock and heat here, for instance. So we have a lot of homes that are not particularly energy efficient. And again, you have people who don't necessarily have access to the finance and the capital to do things like installing heat pumps. And so I would only just reiterate and echo what David just said, which is that there's a real need, as well as the kind of the sort of nudging, to actually make it as easy as possible for the people who stand to benefit the most to make those changes. And whether that's home energy efficiency plans that mean people will get grants and that you can switch to heat pumps or whatever while you're doing other renovations, whatever it is, there's an individual kind of impetus there, but there's also something that falls on local and national governments to make it as easy as possible for people to make those changes in their behaviours.
Thanks, Leslie. Lee, I'm just wondering if there's anything you want to add in terms of the farming community specifically, and Celine's question about supporting the transition from high input, high yield systems to sort of more knowledge-based agroecological systems.
Yeah, I mean, I think getting behaviour change is the real challenge, you know, and I think we've, a few of us are sort of working in this area, have certainly found it so. But I would also pick up from what other people on the panel have said, that since the COVID pandemic, one thing that has come across is that people can change behaviour and do quite dramatically if there's a need. And certainly working with a lot of the farming community, I think the key thing that Leslie said there was, and Dave actually, is to make it accessible and easy for people to change. Otherwise it just won't happen. You know, I think, you know, some work we've done with farmers before, and we've certainly on the disease side, when we've maybe advocated a certain thing that would help them, what really persuaded them in some ways was that it was better for their business to do that. So they had a real incentive to do it. There was maybe a welfare benefit, there was a business benefit, and also there's a collective benefit. So there are sort of different levels of, what can I say, persuasion, but different ways of working with people. And I think also farmers listen to other farmers. So if there's a group of farmers working together on something, and they get a positive response and they think this is better for their business and better for climate, etc., you're much more likely to get them to do it. So, I think working with groups where they can see a positive benefit and learning from others. So if people go in and say, this is what you should do, most people won't do it unless they can really see why they're doing it. So I think there is a different levels of communication, but depending on where other people are coming from, what's important for them, and making it easy for them, either through government grants. There's a bit of persuasion, but there's also that added incentive too. And if I go right back to the sort of Earth rising picture, I think anyone looking at that will just see that's our planet, that's how fragile it is. We can all do something to change that, but we need to know how to do it. And as the others are saying, is make it accessible and easy for people to do something.
And I think, sorry, Lorna, you were going to come in.
I was just going to add to what Lee said. We have that evidence base. We've got fantastic resolution of information and data that we have in Scotland. It's getting that constructed. We work well with landowners, land managers, farmers, the whole range of people, as well as working well with policy. But ultimately, getting that adopted, it's often about having the right skills and training. So it's organisations like SRUC, RET, getting work done with the people and having the right skills in the right places, so that you have got the people where you're planting trees with that. So it's not just a whole load of people brought into that community, but the jobs are in the local area. It's not just short-termism, it's long-termism as well. And I would add that behaviour change, it's a very difficult thing. And we know that with the sugar tax, when Iron Brew reduced their sugar content, people still drank more and more and more of it. So it is one part of the solution. We maybe have to think about health by stealth as well.
And that sort of making it easy for people, I think, is absolutely critical, and particularly the infrastructure point. I remember a long time ago when I was doing work on climate change behaviours, there was a bin strike in Edinburgh, and the recycling rates went up phenomenally, not because people had changed their mind or were being better persuaded about the merits or rise of recycling, but simply because the landfill bins were full and the recycling ones weren't. So, I mean, that's a very almost facetious example, but this doesn't need to be complicated as well. Pete?
Yeah, I think there's a role for governments and local authorities through public procurement. I mean, they buy the food that go on the school menus and the hospital menus, and normalising different dietary choices is one way that we can do that. So at least providing good vegan and vegetarian options. I would say having meat-free days, and maybe having entirely meat-free canteens rather, because we can normalise it by showing that unbelievably there is really nice vegan and vegetarian meals out there, and you don't have to have meat in every dish to make it yummy.
Thanks, Pete. And I wanted maybe, and I can maybe just stick with you, is to pick up the food waste point, because I think that's something that I think people don't always realise, just actually how much food we waste. And there's a question about whether food larders might be one way of helping with that. Could you say a little bit more about food waste and what we might do about it?
Yeah, it could be. We currently waste about 30% of all food in Scotland. It's similar actually all over the globe, but in developing countries it tends to be lost. The food loss and waste tends to occur in the field before it reaches market. But in industrialized countries like ours, it tends to happen after harvest and at the supermarket stage, because the vegetables are, have blemishes or they're the wrong shape or something, and after we buy them. So ending things like buy one get one free offers on perishable products would be an easy thing to do. And you could even imagine offering, you can buy one get one free on bananas, but you buy one get one free, but you get a voucher for your next purchase where you get your bananas next week for free. So you don't end up taking the bananas home and wasting a load of them. So there's some simple things to do to nudge us in the right direction there.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in? Dave? And then Lee.
Yeah, so I mean, reducing food waste is just one of those big win-wins, just in terms of reducing costs for people, but emissions as well. And I mean, one of the things is portion size. So that is something which I know results in a lot of wastage through RAP, so their household surveys. Like Pete says, a lot of our food waste occurs in Scotland at the household level. But the other great example I've seen is looking at, so this goes back to public procurement, and one of the universities, they did some research looking at what was the most popular stuff in their cafeteria. And they found, and they looked in the bins as well, and they found that ham sandwiches apparently are the most likely thrown in the bin. I don't know what kind of ham they were using. So they took the ham sandwiches off the menu because that was being wasted a lot. And that massively reduced how much food waste overall was going in. So this was for their conferences and things like that. So again, it comes back to good data and good science, and actually looking at the data, looking at how people are behaving. And actually, with a little bit of a change, just taking away the ham sandwiches, for instance, they were able to reduce the food waste and the carbon footprint of their food system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks so much, Dave. Lee?
I was just going to make the point about education, actually, and working with schools, working with children, about food, where the food comes from, and cooking. And I think if you understand all that and you are involved in cooking your own food, or looking at, is again, reading on to what Dave said about dietary choices as well, is you're likely to get a lot less waste because the kids are choosing what they want, and hopefully it's very nutritious, but they're involved in food. And I think when we were all growing up, we were much more involved in food and cooking. And I think there's a bit of a disconnect in that now that we need to really address, which makes a difference to how we handle waste, because I think we would treat food differently. And the other point I wanted to make is some really interesting projects going on with, you know, taking waste and repurposing it in circular economy for biofuels, things like that. So there's things we can do with waste. I'm sounding a bit like a womble now, but there's lots of, showing my age. But the point I really wanted to make was back to sort of education, children, getting people involved in cooking and food and local produce.
Thank you. Lorna?
I would say the diversity in the diet is important as well, and shortening that supply chain from production to consumption, and that can be locally. But I think we need to get the procurement issue sorted out so that the schools are able to buy the local food, so that it enables it, whereas at the moment they have to buy the cheapest or somewhere else because they've got longer term contracts. So I think we need to get the local farmers working with the local communities and local councils so we get procurement better sorted.
Thank you very much, Lorna. Well, I'm afraid we are coming to the end of our time. I'm sorry, there's a few questions we've not got to about the place of agriculture, about green jobs for young people, about permanent grassland. I do want to just actually very quickly ask Pete just to give an answer to what was the first question asked. It seems a bit unfair not to ask the very first question that was asked, which was from James Lewis, who was just asking Pete about the 1.5 degrees and what's the sort of scientific reasoning behind that.
It was not really a scientific reason for it at the outset. It occurred during the negotiation in Paris, where the Association of Small Island States said 2 degrees is not good enough. If we have a 2 degrees target, we're all underwater. So they managed to force through a 1.5 degrees target. But lots of work has been done, lots of research has been done since then on the difference between 1.5 and 2. We can show multiple benefits of retaining the temperature at 1.5 rather than 2. It's not just the small island states that suffer if we push up to a 2 degree target. There's a whole bunch of ecosystem services and discontinuities that we will experience if we go from 1.5 to 2. Not least the increased prevalence of extreme events like wildfires, droughts, and other weather extremes, droughts and floods and such like. So we've sort of retrofitted the science to cope with that 1.5 after the politicians decided it was a political decision, but it turns out to be not better just for the small island states, but better for everybody on the planet.
Thanks very much, Pete. And thanks very much to all our panelists and our respondents, and of course to Pete for doing such a fantastic talk. We've covered an awful lot of issues there: behaviour change, importing food or exporting it, and other goods, justice, finances, funding. I'm not even going to try and sum up, but I will now pass over to Professor Sarah Skerratt, who's going to close today's event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think my job is to try and pull out a very small number of themes in an even smaller number of minutes. So I shall do so really rapidly and echo Rebekah's thanks. And thanks for just great chairing, Rebekah, and a fantastic, I was going to say bunch, that sounds a bit informal, but group of experts here this afternoon. So very briefly, the main themes that jumped out for me were time, and Pete's phrase at the beginning, this is the decade of action for science and evidence. Secondly, engagement with those affected who can offer solutions and innovation, including the private sector, as well as communities and the public sector. Thirdly, that rural Scotland is lived in, it's a working and productive environment, and that green recovery must take this into account, including attracting new entrants and those with energy and vigour. Thirdly, a strong theme around just transition and just recovery and links with social policy, and that we must have systems thinking in Scotland and beyond to bring in that international dimension. Next, evidence-based, as you'd expect in this theme. We must be evidence-based, and that includes debunking myths also, and co-producing knowledge and co-producing evidence and communicating that evidence clearly and in a compelling way. The sixth out of 7 themes is being multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary in producing that science and communicating that science. And I would end then, before I close with thanks, in saying again, welcome to the decade of action, where there is so much to play for, especially for the next generations. So those were the main themes coming through. So thanks again to the RSE and SCRR for another joint event, and particularly to Professor Peter Wilson and his family for engendering this very important joint event that allows these important debates to take place. Thanks to all who've participated. Thank you.